How you feeling?
I feel good. I'm glad to be back in the studio. By studio, I mean my parents' spare room.
Yeah. But a studio in our hearts.
A studio in our hearts. I'm Myelane.
And I'm Michael, and we're on the grad school journey to becoming licensed therapists.
Come with us to class as we discuss and dissect all we can learn about mental health, relationships, therapy techniques, and everything in between.
With your two favorite therapists in training, this is Therapy in Progress.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, Myelane. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
It's good to be back.
First podcast recording of 2025.
That's crazy. That's crazy. It feels like it hasn't been that long, but also, if I think back to our last one, it was like a while ago.
Yeah.
This is different because this is our first time recording since we've started putting them out.
Yeah.
So it feels kind of different now. We know what it feels like to actually have people listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah. Speaking of which, now that we're kind of in the groove of things, our social media is up and running, please get in touch with us anytime. You can find us Instagram, Therapy in Progress Pod.
Yes.
Our DMs are always open. We would love to hear from you in terms of questions or suggestions or anything. We would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where else are we?
We're also on TikTok and YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, and it's the same handle, Therapy in Progress Pod.
Amazing. We're doing the thing.
We're doing the thing.
How's class? I feel like we haven't checked in since this is our first one of 2025.
Yeah.
We are halfway through spring semester. We just finished midterms.
Yes.
How are you feeling?
I feel good.
Yeah.
I took a lot of classes, so I thought it was going to be really heavy, but I feel like I'm managing okay.
Good.
Which is amazing.
Good.
Yeah. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. I love this semester. All of the classes are bangers. They're really, really good.
Love it.
I'm in a law and ethics class. That's fascinating. I don't know if people know that we've talked about the licensure exam that we have to take to become licensed. We also have to take a full separate law and ethics California MFT exam.
We have to do that to be an associate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that class is fascinating. And yeah, things are really good. I've had a few questions. People ask me like, what does therapy school look like? So I wanted to share one really cool assignment that we're doing right now. I'm in a techniques of psychotherapy class. And the way we're learning is that we are partnered up with people in the class and we go off hours, we meet outside of class and using everything we're learning in class. So we're learning very technical skills and techniques of, reflection of feelings and confrontation and summarizing and how to use silence. We're using like very technical skills.
Yeah.
So we take everything we learn, we go with our partner and we actually conduct hour-long therapy sessions for each other. And what we do is that we record it and then we bring the recording into class and we play it for everybody. And so we get feedback.
You do a recording of it?
Yes. So
that's amazing.
So you
can see your body language and everything.
We do audio.
Just audio.
Yeah, other classes might do video, but no, we bring in the audio, and so the whole class listens to it, and the professor gives you critique and gives you feedback, and we kind of talk about how are you using the skills, is it effective, and then also what's really cool, we have to write up a transcript of sections of the therapy conversation that we had, and we have to like annotate it with an analysis of like, when I said this, I was using this skill, and this is why I did that. We have to like justify what we did.
Wow.
And also not only the positive things, but also critique ourselves in the annotations and be like, oh, so here, as you can see, this didn't quite work. I should have tried this instead. So it's really technical, and it's really, the few people who have asked about that, who I've shared that with them, they're fascinated at what a science it is.
Yeah.
That it's not just like we're learning these amorphous things, and it's like, no, we're actually like applying skills and writing up transcripts and getting critiqued on audio, and like it's really cool.
I love that. I love how that class was set up.
Something else really cool that we did in that class, we had a unit on suicide assessment and suicidality assessment and intervention, and our professor, with permission of course from the client, brought in an audio of a real session she did with a client who came in reporting feeling suicidal.
Wow.
And so to really apply what we were learning, she said, this is she's very experienced. She's been doing this for decades. She said, listen to how I navigated these things that we've been talking about. And hearing it in a real world context like that was so helpful. And so I feel like in that 3-hour class that night, I like walked away with a completely different understanding of how to handle that kind of thing.
What was the takeaway? What was different?
My biggest takeaway, and this I think is really important for people who are listening, because a lot of us, either ourselves or friends and family, we've known people close to us who might be dealing with those kinds of feelings. What I really took away was that it is not something to tiptoe around or be delicate about. A lot of people are afraid, but if you will never cause somebody to hurt themselves if you ask them openly, are you thinking of hurting yourself?
Right.
People are afraid to ask that, but the experts agree, it's very clear that an open, direct, blunt question and blunt conversation is very helpful and necessary for safety. So the best, a professor last semester told us this too, the best advice for if you have a suspicion is just ask the person openly, are you thinking of hurting yourself? And you asking that question is not going to cause them to do that,
right,
even though it feels uncomfortable. So it was great to learn that.
That is really great for people to know, that you can just address things head on.
Yeah.
You don't have to tiptoe around it, and you maybe shouldn't tiptoe around it.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, also tell them about, because you and I are in psychopharmacology together, which for people who don't know is about the science behind medication for psychiatric medication. In our midterm, we had a vignette that we had to analyze. Tell them what that looks like in terms of an assignment.
Yeah, so for the context of this class, so vignettes are basically like a case conceptualization. So we are brought either a made-up or real-life client that our professor has had, and we analyze the information given about that individual. So it could be like Jane Doe, cisgender Caucasian 26-year-old woman. And it gives us all of the information on the chief complaint. What are the symptoms that this person is experiencing? How is that presenting in their life? What's the impact? And what is the environment around this person? And also sometimes even the history of this person, maybe their experience in therapy prior, or even family history as well.
So then we have to take that vignette and we have to put together a treatment plan, a diagnosis, in psychopharmacology specifically, even though in real life, disclaimer, therapists do not prescribe medication. For the purpose of this class, we say these are the medications I would pursue just because we're learning the science behind it. So it's a really cool way to apply the stuff we're learning. I've noticed almost every single class uses vignettes, because you have to. It's like, okay, you've learned the theory, now this is your client, how are you going to apply it?
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah. It's really cool to see also how psychiatrists might approach a client, because it is different.
And for anyone who doesn't know, a psychiatrist is also a mental health professional, but that is a medical doctor who went to medical school, has an MD, prescribes medication, as opposed to a psychologist or a psychotherapist who is not a medical doctor, but is a healthcare provider in the mental health space.
Yeah. And it's important to know the difference, because therapists, while they may be knowledgeable about different medications, they cannot prescribe and they cannot recommend medications.
But what therapists can do is diagnose.
Yes.
I've had some people ask me about that because they didn't realize that psychotherapists, at least in California, are fully qualified and trained to diagnose mental health disorders.
Yes.
Yeah, which is a lot of the learning that we do in class as well. Yeah. Have we talked about the DSM?
I actually don't think we've talked about the DSM.
I'm going to do a quick DSM moment because it's going to be relevant for what we're talking about today. So the DSM is the Bible, right, of mental health disorders.
Yes.
It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right, of all mental health disorders. And what it is basically, it's this very long, dense, complicated document about every currently recognized disorder, all the facts and figures about the criteria for the diagnosis. There's so much in there about the onset of a diagnosis and comorbidity, which means overlap with other disorders, and
differential diagnoses.
How it can be overlapping or confused or similar to other diagnoses as well. So the DSM is something that we in school learn a lot about, not only learning literally what's in it, but also how to use it, how to read it, how to pick it apart and apply it to a patient, right? So also, I will point out that like the DSM is in no way a perfect document.
No, it is not.
In fact, it is quite flawed. We've had some professors who blatantly say like, I hate the DSM.
Yeah.
Right? Because human emotion and the human brain can't be put on a spreadsheet. And yet the DSM kind of by nature has to try to do that, because we have to try to like scientifically quantify these things.
Right.
So it is a necessary thing, but I don't know. Psychology is a very case-by-case basis, and the DSM is very black or white.
Yeah.
So it's an important tool, but it's not perfect. So
yeah.
and it also it gets updated.
It does. We're on the 5th edition right now.
Yeah.
The next edition, I think, is supposed to come out in the next couple years.
Yeah, a new edition comes out every 10,
something like
15 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of space in between, so there's a lot of time for them to... The editions look very, very different from each other.
They really do.
Yeah.
And even in between, they'll make like little tweaks, little adjustments.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's not a perfect document, but it's always evolving.
Yeah.
And it's a great tool, but it's not comprehensive of everything that might be going on in a person's life.
Right, because people are more complicated.
The DSM is also used by insurance companies. So a lot of times in order to get covered by insurance, you have to have some kind of diagnosis. So therapists will use umbrella diagnoses like adjustment disorder in order to help people get their therapy sessions covered.
Yeah, that's a good point too. That is true. A lot of professors have said one of the big reasons we're learning DSM is just insurance.
Yeah.
Because that's just the reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that they're making up diagnoses
No,
just
of
like
course
out of
not.
the blue for the purposes of insurance. But adjustment disorder would be like you're going through a transitional phase and it's hard for you.
Right.
So, and it's valid and it should be covered by insurance, but there is that diagnosis.
Yeah, that's a good point. Diagnoses obviously are never, ever, ever just like made up or pulled out of a hat. But a lot of providers, especially like private practice providers, they don't see any need for the DSM. They say, I'm not going to diagnose you. I'm just going to treat you as a whole person.
Right.
They have the freedom to do that because they don't have to bill to insurance. If you have to bill to insurance, you have to say F41 point whatever, diagnosis of, generalized anxiety disorder. So that's a good distinction that like the diagnosis is always going to be accurate. It's just some therapists, if they don't have that obligation to insurance, they prefer to just treat the person as a whole instead of thinking in DSM terms.
Right.
But yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's a totally different approach. Like you can go diagnostically, kind of taking a more medical approach to therapy, and then you can also say, I don't know if I believe in pathology to this extent, so my approach is going to be different based on that.
Yeah. DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Speaking of which, what are we talking about today?
Personality disorders.
Yes, fascinating stuff.
Absolutely fascinating. Some of the most complex and intricate disorders, I think, in the DSM.
Yeah. And the reason that I'm glad we brought up the DSM is because personality disorder sounds kind of vague. It's a very specific class of disorders. There's currently 10 recognized personality disorders in the DSM.
Yes. I think a good place to start might be, what is a personality disorder?
Yeah. So a personality disorder is a long-term pattern of both behavior and inner experience that a person has that is kind of fundamental to their personality. So it's different from something like a mood disorder, like depression or one of the depressive disorders, because those are something that is like an affliction to your functioning for a period of time. It might be a very long period of time, but it's not representative of you at a baseline. Right? And theoretically, with proper treatment, one of those mood disorders could go away entirely. A personality disorder is going to be more stable throughout someone's life. So these are ongoing patterns of how somebody experiences their emotions, regulates their emotions, regulates their behavior, relates to other people in relationships, right? So think of the fundamental things that make up a person's personality. This is when there is dysfunction in that arena. Right? So take something, for example, like PTSD. PTSD is a disorder that arises in response to something very specific, and you have it for the length of time you have it. You might have it for years and years and years and years.
You might have it for the rest of your life.
Correct.
But it's not fundamental to your being.
Correct.
Who you are.
And theoretically, again, it could be treated completely to disappear with proper medication, therapy, etc. Personality disorders, while they can absolutely be treated, and millions of people get to a very happy, functional, everyday level with them, they still are always going to be a part of that person's makeup.
So if personality is a combination of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that make us, then it must come from somewhere. So where do personality disorders come from? Yeah, the most, as with everything in psychology, the answer is kind of nobody knows for sure. The most accepted theory is this theory that they call developmental psychopathology, which basically says that there is this complicated
interplay, this like matrix between genetics and environment. So nature and nurture.
So it's both together.
It's both together. So the idea is that a person is already genetically predisposed to one of these disorders. And then on top of that, if they have a series of early life experiences that triggers this response, this disorder, if everything lines up just right, so to speak, you might end up at the place where you have a diagnosis or you have a pathology.
So your biology plays a role of already at a baseline, you're susceptible to developing a disorder like this, and then there's some trigger event or multiple events that would cause it to arise and start to
Absolutely.
take hold.
And the fascinating thing is that most of these environmental or events, things like that, happen very, very early in life. And yet they find that the actual symptoms of personality disorders don't pop up until adolescence or early adulthood.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a delay in the presentation of it, because it's usually something from teens to early 20s to mid-20s that they start actually seeing the patterns.
Yeah.
Even though it goes back to not only genetics before you were even born, but also very, very young early life experiences. So these 10 personality disorders, the DSM separates or kind of organizes into 3 different clusters.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
So we have cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. Cluster A is more defined as kind of the more odd or eccentric type of personality disorders. So that consists of schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder.
Okay.
Then we have cluster B, which is defined as more dramatic or erratic. So the personality disorders in that cluster would be borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic. And then our last but not least, cluster C, that one is more characterized by anxious or fearful traits. So we're looking at avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Which is not obsessive compulsive disorder.
No.
OCD and OCPD personality disorder are 2 very different things, which we will talk about.
It's confusing because the acronym sounds so similar, and obsessive compulsive disorder versus obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
A lot of things in the DSM are just badly named, in my opinion.
Oh, 1,000%.
It's just like not intuitive. For example, in cluster B, you mentioned antisocial personality disorder. A lot of people hear that and they think they know what that means. Oh, because it's antisocial. It's not at all the way we commonly use the word antisocial to mean.
Not at all.
Like people think, oh, that person keeps to themselves and is a loner and et cetera, et cetera. That is not what that disorder is about at all.
No.
But it's called that because in a more technical term or a more technical sense, that's how they use the word antisocial. We'll get to all that in a second. Yeah, so those are the 3 clusters. And just to be super clear, for example, cluster C, you were saying anxious and fearful. Anxiety is not a personality disorder.
No.
That is its own thing, like we were talking about before with depression, things like that. So all they're saying is that the disorders in cluster C are marked by just more anxious or fearful personalities, but anxiety itself is not one of the disorders.
Exactly. That's a really great distinction that we need to,
Yeah.
I think one thing that we should address is the difference between a personality trait and a personality disorder.
Yes, 100%. Because when people talk about these things, anyone, any person is going to read about any of these 10 and recognize certain things in themselves. We all have aspects of any of these.
Yeah.
That does not mean you have the disorder.
Right.
Right? A disorder is when it becomes pervasive, when it is rigid and stable in all areas of your life. So we're talking social, romantic, professional, family. It's very pervasive, and you find dysfunction consistently. That's the key.
Right.
Just because you like being alone and you recharge by yourself and you're an introvert does not mean you have schizoid personality disorder.
Right.
Just because your coworker is very driven and cutthroat and selfish sometimes, that does not mean that they are a sociopath with antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah.
Right? So we all have personality traits. So talk more about the difference between what is a trait?
Yeah. So a trait is just going to be a characteristic that you possess that's just innate in your personality. So like we were saying before, just as an example, being an extrovert versus an introvert, that would be more of a trait, whereas a disorder would be characterized, like you were saying, about the intensity, the rigidity, and the negative impact of that trait.
Noticeable dysfunction in multiple areas of your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we you could spend a lifetime talking about any one of these 10. Should we go through just super quickly and just kind of touch on what each one of them looks like very briefly?
Absolutely.
Full disclaimer to all of our listeners, we love talking about these. If you are particularly interested in any one of them, we could do an entire episode on literally just one of them.
For sure.
So this is going to be very broad overview. Let us know if you want any more specifics. So where do you want to start?
Let's start with cluster A.
Okay.
So let's look at paranoid personality disorder.
Yeah, so these are the odd or eccentric ones. That's how the DSM tends to label them. So paranoid personality disorder is somebody who has a pervasive, steady pattern of deep distrust of other people. And it really affects their life and relationships because they believe everyone is out to get them, everyone is dangerous. And this is close people, family, friends, colleagues. This is somebody who sees things where there are not. And I don't mean that literally like a hallucination. I mean that as social interactions that are completely benign will be interpreted as very dangerous or having an ulterior motive or a threat to that person.
Right.
So somebody with paranoid personality disorder obviously has a really hard time forming and keeping relationships because of this fearful distrust of all areas of their life.
Yeah, that would definitely be something that's impactful for all of your relationships across all spheres of your life.
Yeah. Okay, take us into schizoid.
Yeah. So schizoid personality disorder is when someone is not really interested in interacting with other people. It's just not in their nature. So someone who has schizoid personality disorder is going to be a little bit more flat. They don't experience the highs and lows that most people do. And they also don't feel a strong connection to others. So they might avoid social interactions on purpose and just prefer to be alone. They typically don't have any interest in romantic relationships and sometimes even sex.
So it's kind of this like fundamental lack of any interest in human connection.
Right.
Wow.
Take us into schizotypal.
Schizotypal, again, because of the naming of these disorders, people think overlaps with schizoid because they sound similar. But really what schizotypal is somebody with very obviously strange outward behavior. So this is it used to be called latent schizophrenia. It's not called that anymore. So a person with schizotypal personality disorder is not having full-blown hallucinations like somebody with schizophrenia is having. But a person with schizotypal personality disorder, the way they speak and move and dress, it's very noticeable oddities in behavior. And this person might be experiencing thought delusions. They might be experiencing magical thinking, like they think that they have powers, or that sometimes we say delusions of reference. For example, if you're watching the news, you think the anchor is talking to you specifically because the story is about you, which it's not. So schizotypal is a very... that's why it's called in the DSM bizarre or eccentric, because the behavior is very noticeable that this person is experiencing a slightly different reality. Yeah. Should we move into cluster B?
Yeah.
What's first?
Let's first go into borderline personality disorder.
Yeah. So borderline personality disorder is thought of primarily as a disorder of emotional regulation. So somebody's going to have a lot of emotional lability. What that means is a proneness to really shifting back and forth between extremes. So borderline personality is often marked by unstable relationships, because sometimes things that to somebody without borderline would be a very small moment of friction or a slight or something like that, somebody with borderline would react in a very large way. So this puts a lot of strain on relationships. Also, a hallmark of borderline is a very intense fear of abandonment.
Right.
So that plays obviously into relationships a lot as well. So yeah, it's thought of as a disorder that does a lot to one's sense of self and one's sense of relationships in terms of emotional instability and the effect that that has on one's inner and outer world.
Yeah. I think people with borderline personality disorder can be interpreted as being dramatic, and that's not necessarily what's happening. It's that they're feeling their emotions so intensely without having the typical sense of emotional regulation that other people might have. So it can lead to impulsive behaviors, it could lead to mood swings, and then, yeah, it can really affect your interpersonal relationships and also your relationship with yourself.
Absolutely. How about narcissistic personality disorder?
Yeah, so people who have narcissistic personality disorder have this constant need for approval, for validation, and for praise. And through that, they may be dismissive of other people's emotions, and that can be sort of a lack of empathy. So, in a person who has this disorder, their interpersonal relationships are more focused on self than on the relationship as a unit.
People with narcissistic personality disorder tend to be so inwardly focused and so have such an elevated sense of self that like the way that manifests is being really dismissive of other people's emotions and situations, and so it oftentimes manifests as a lack of empathy or a lack of feeling toward others because the self is such the focus.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap between narcissistic personality disorder and the remaining two disorders, histrionic and antisocial personality disorders.
Should we break it down?
Yeah, let's break it down.
Okay. Let's start with histrionic.
Histrionic. So there's an overlap here because it can seem very grandiose. There's this outward expression of
Big emotion.
huge, big emotion, very much seeking validation, approval, and attention. And the reason for that is that a person who has histrionic personality disorder needs that kind of validation and approval from external places in order to satisfy their own self-concept.
So their self-understanding is completely hinging on the validation and attention of others.
Exactly.
So what we see a lot with histrionic is in relationships, a person with histrionic personality disorder will treat casual acquaintances as if they are best friends that go back forever. So they will make use of relationships as if they are much closer than they actually are in reality. They also will use sex appeal and seduction and romantic attention to try to draw people in and entice people and almost manipulate people to bring them into that inner circle of give me attention, give me validation. So those are two kind of hallmarks that people might look for.
Yeah. And if they don't receive that validation externally, then it can feel like an attack or that they're not good enough. And then they might seek that approval in other ways from the person that they're trying to seek that reaction from.
So that's histrionic.
Yeah.
Antisocial personality disorder, I am fascinated by.
Yes.
So this is what colloquially is thought of as a sociopath or a psychopath.
Right.
So sociopath and psychopath are not clinical terms. They are not a part of any diagnosis. They're not in the DSM. But colloquially, that is what antisocial personality disorder is.
Yeah.
So don't be fooled by the word antisocial. It doesn't mean that somebody doesn't like people and likes to be alone. In fact, a lot of people with antisocial personality disorder outwardly can appear very social and very charming.
Very charismatic.
Charismatic. What antisocial personality disorder is a lack of empathy, a lack of regard for the rights of others, a lack of regard for following social norms, for following laws, for following rules. And the interesting thing with this is that internally, not only is there a lack of empathy, but there's also a lack of like fear of consequence and fear of danger, the way that someone else might experience. Yeah. So for example, if you or I get pulled over for speeding, our heart's going to race, our palms are going to get sweaty, right?
Yeah.
Someone with antisocial personality disorder, no physical arousal whatsoever.
Right. Just
cool as a cucumber because they don't feel that danger, which is why sometimes it's associated with crime because people with antisocial, all of those things kind of converge, right? A disregard for following rules, social norms, danger, consequence, rights of others, that leads some people with this disorder to be able to do certain things that other people might not do.
Right, because people with antisocial personality disorder don't have the same range of emotions that we have. It can be really dulled or blunted. So I imagine that it's hard to empathize with others, connect with others, when you don't feel anxiety, you don't feel sadness, you don't feel love, or at least very minimally. So when you are confronted with situations where you might be getting in trouble or you're expected to relate to others in a certain way and you don't have that capacity for yourself, how can you experience what that might be like for others or conceptualize what that might be like for others?
Totally. So that's cluster B. Should we finish it out?
Let's finish it out.
All right.
Cluster C.
Anxious or fearful.
Do you want to go to dependent personality disorder?
Yeah, so dependent personality disorder is actually one of the ones that is more what it sounds like. A person with dependent personality disorder cannot be independent. so has a really hard time making decisions for themselves, has a really hard time being self-sufficient. So this person will usually attach themselves to one or more others that they rely on for day-to-day approval of any tiny little thing they do, especially, not even to mention, big life decisions.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of professionally, personally, things like that.
It really inhibits your functioning because if you need somebody to this degree in order to make any kind of decision and you're relying on others this much, you can feel really helpless when you don't have that person to lean on.
Absolutely. How about avoidant personality disorder?
Avoidant personality disorder is more of an extreme fear of rejection or criticism. So this person might avoid social activities because of it, because they're not feeling like they're good enough, and they isolate themselves, even though they do want to feel connected to other people.
Mm-hmm. So there's a difference between that and schizoid, because schizoid is a lack of desire for human connection. Avoidant, you might end up at the same place, but the reasons are very, very different. Avoidant sounds more like that deep fear is what is keeping the person avoiding social contact.
Yeah. So schizoid is just, I feel no desire. Avoidant personality disorder is about that fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people with avoidant personality disorder are constantly monitoring interactions, social situations. It's really tough and it's really exhausting because it's such a deep-rooted fear of being received negatively or perceived negatively that it really keeps people from engaging in those social settings.
Yeah.
And finally,
last but not least, we have OCPD.
Yes, can I get on my soapbox for a second?
Please do.
Okay, so once again, OCPD, personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, is very, very different from OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. It's one of those moments with the DSM that I'm like, why the hell did you name them so similarly when they're not very similar? OCD is an anxiety-driven disorder. This is we'll talk about it later. I'm sure we'll do at least a full episode on it.
At least.
Yes. OCD is a very complex interplay between debilitating intrusive thoughts and then the compulsive behaviors that are developed in order to keep those thoughts at bay. So it's this call and response between obsession, compulsion. OCPD, personality disorder, is, like any of the other 10 we've talked about, a personality, right? So this is someone who is so rigidly tied to control and to the way things are done that the overall actually getting the thing done becomes second.
Yes.
Right? So think of it in a professional context, somebody who the project doesn't even end up getting done because that person is so obsessed, OCPD, with the minutia within the project.
The perfection of it.
So colloquially, I think when a lot of people kind of casually reference OCD, it's actually a lot closer, what they're thinking of is closer to OCPD than it actually is to OCD. So somebody with OCPD, this can really affect relationships because somebody will really be thinking in black and white. There's no room for nuance. There's no room for gray area, which can be very hard when it comes to relating to other people. So someone with OCPD is going to be more tied to those perhaps more stereotypical things like timing, schedule, order, cleanliness, having things the way they want them in a controlled fashion.
Yeah.
So that, if that sounds like what you thought OCD is, it actually is a lot closer to OCPD, while OCD is a lot more about the intrusive thoughts and the compulsive behaviors. So yeah, so OCPD can be tough on relationships because it's hard to work professionally or relate personally to someone who is so rigidly tied to the, quote, my way or the highway.
That lack of flexibility.
Yeah. Okay, woof. How do you feel?
That was another info dumping session.
That was a lot of good stuff, though.
I mean, it's important to know.
It's important to know because, again, a lot of people, these are common, right? So you may have somebody in your life with one of these 10 personality disorders, but don't be fooled because, as we said earlier, every single one of us has elements of any of them.
Yeah.
Right?
We do.
Like, a lot of people like things very neatly and orderly and they're very punctual. That does not mean they have OCPD, right? Some people might have mood swings. That does not mean they have borderline personality disorder.
Someone might have an anxious attachment style. That does not mean that you have dependent personality disorder.
Callback. to our previous episode. So again, remind us, when does it actually become a personality disorder?
It becomes a personality disorder based on the intensity, the rigidity, and the negative impact on your life.
Yes. How pervasive is it? How much is it woven into the fabric of your day-to-day life and your day-to-day relationships consistently? Yeah.
So then how do we manage relationships as someone with a personality disorder or with a supporter, somebody who's in relationship with?
Yeah. It depends on the disorder. They've seen certain disorders are very responsive to treatment, others are not.
Right.
So statistically, antisocial personality disorder is very difficult to treat. Borderline is very successful in treatment.
It's just getting some of these people to
Yes.
seek out the treatment.
That might be the tough part, is that first jump to the person realizing that they need help and need tools for how to mitigate these patterns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be extremely challenging to change your personality. It's debated if that's even possible. But I think what's really important here is that regardless of if you were to have a personality disorder, you can still have a very full and fulfilling and functional life existing with it.
Yeah.
So since personality disorders are so common, a lot of people might find themselves in relationship with, whether that be platonic or romantic or within their family dynamic, someone who does have a personality disorder.
Yeah.
So then how do we manage the difference between emotional support and fixing? Because a lot of the times we just want to do that quick fix. We want to make sure that the person in our life is okay in the way that we want them to versus supporting them in the way that they need to be supported.
I think that's the key. What you just said, we can't fix. I don't think we have the ability to fix someone else. You can only work on yourself. So if it's somebody close to you who you love, you can be there to, I think, support the choice to get treatment. But at the end of the day, it's up to that person whether they want to pursue that. So all you can do as the individual yourself is set healthy boundaries.
Healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
What do healthy boundaries look like?
If you have a parent who is narcissistic or who has narcissistic personality disorder, you have to set the emotional boundary for yourself and learn to understand them as the parent that they are rather than the parent that you needed them to be.
What is the role of therapy with personality disorders?
It depends on the personality disorder. So for something like borderline personality disorder, DBT, which we've talked about, dialectical behavior therapy, is very, very helpful because it's all about emotional regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. Those are some pillars of DBT, which, if you remember what we talked about with borderline, that's like right up the alley of how do I regulate my emotions? How do I navigate my relationships? Right? Take something like dependent or avoidant personality disorder, those things that are fear-based, that's absolutely helped in therapy if you can really get in there and start facing those fears and rewiring the underlying anxieties that are causing you to be avoidant or dependent. Yes, you will always have, as we've talked about, a semblance of that in your personality, but your day-to-day functioning can get much, much more functional with the proper treatment because those are... So it really, to answer your question, it really depends on which disorder we're talking about and the presentation of it.
Yeah.
Because any of these disorders also can be present on a very wide spectrum of intensity, you know?
Absolutely.
It can be completely debilitating, moderately debilitating, or it can even, through treatment, have gotten to the point where it's totally functional.
Right.
So it just depends. Did we do it?
I think we did it.
Oh my goodness. What a marathon. That was a great one, though. You know what's stuck in my head right now? Ba-dum-bum, ba-dum-bum, bum. Our theme song.
When you were sending it to me, just like your little drafts, I loved it. I was like, oh, I'm part of the process.
It's like, it's really, every step along the way of doing this, as it's become like, when you first sent me all of the mock-ups of like the thumbnails that you made, that was so exciting, or like making a theme music, or even just like setting up an account, it makes it feel really like real. It's cool. Yeah. It's fun. How you feeling?
I feel good. I'm glad to be back in the studio. By studio, I mean my parents' spare room.
But a studio in our hearts.
A studio in our hearts.
Awesome. All right. Any last thoughts?
If you have a personality disorder, or if you have somebody in your life who has a personality disorder, there's always hope. There's always treatment. There's always options. So you can live that life worth living.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Get in touch. Tune in next week. Episodes out every Monday. Until next time.
I'm Miley.
And I'm Michael.
Thank you for watching Therapy in Progress.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Therapy in Progress is produced for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to substitute for professional medical or mental health care.
Views expressed here are our own. If you're in need of support, we encourage you to reach out to a licensed professional.
Your mental health matters. Talk to you next time.